The grand chandelier suspended above the gala cast fractured, prismatic light across the faces of the corporate elite, illuminating the perfect, practiced sorrow of the widow and the grieving brother. I stood near the massive archway leading to the terrace, allowing the heavy velvet drapes to swallow the edges of my silhouette. The unfamiliar charcoal suit hung perfectly from my frame, a stark departure from the relaxed, informal clothing I used to wear. The tailored cut restricted my movements slightly, forcing a rigid, disciplined posture that suited the man I had become. I lifted a crystal glass of sparkling water to my lips, letting the rim obscure the lower half of my face. The faint, jagged line of scarred tissue along my jawline throbbed faintly, a phantom ache echoing the violence of the prison yard where Arthur Vance died and Victor Thorne was born. It was the 5th anniversary of the tragic passing of Arthur Vance, beloved founder and CEO. The banners draped over the balconies proclaimed his legacy in elegant gold lettering. The irony tasted like ash, dry and bitter, coating the back of my throat and settling heavily in my lungs. I watched the crowd from my vantage point, scanning the undulating sea of expensive silk, tailored tuxedos, and glittering jewels. They were the very people who had once shaken my hand and toasted to my success. Tonight, they drank my champagne and celebrated my memory, entirely oblivious to the fact that the ghost they mourned was currently observing them from the shadows, his pulse slow and steady, devoid of the warmth they remembered. A low murmur rippled through the center of the room, drawing the collective gaze of the attendees toward the sweeping marble staircase. Marcus Vance descended the steps. My brother, he wore a crimson suit that absorbed the light, an aggressive, flamboyant choice that demanded attention. The fabric strained slightly across his shoulders, a testament to years of indulgent living. He paused halfway down the stairs, resting a hand on the polished brass railing. On his left wrist, a heavy vintage gold watch caught the glare of the chandelier. My watch. The very timepiece our father had given me upon the inception of the company. A sudden, sharp chill washed over my skin, raising the hairs on my arms as my eyes locked onto the stolen gold. Marcus adjusted his cuffs, his gaze sweeping over the crowd below. He carried his chin high, his posture radiating a forced, practiced superiority, but his eyes darted rapidly from face to face, refusing to settle anywhere for long. His fingers drummed a frantic, erratic rhythm against the brass railing before he continued his descent, betraying the nervous energy vibrating beneath his expensive suit. Following closely behind him, her hand resting lightly on his forearm, was Elena. Her long blonde hair was perfectly styled, cascading in loose waves over the bare shoulders of a vibrant emerald green dress. The color was striking, contrasting sharply with the somber occasion they were ostensibly hosting. Around her neck rested a massive, ostentatious diamond necklace that I had explicitly refused to purchase for her during our final year together. The stones refracted the light, casting sharp, cold flashes across her pale skin. She moved with a practiced, fluid grace, her high cheekbones lifted in an expression of elegant melancholy. She nodded to the guests, offering small, measured smiles that never quite reached her piercing green eyes. My stomach knotted, a tight physical coil of disgust tightening as I watched her play the grieving widow with such flawless precision. As they reached the floor, a flock of executives and board members immediately surrounded them. Marcus gestured expansively with his free hand, his voice booming over the string quartet playing softly in the corner. He threw his head back in a loud bark of laughter at a joke offered by one of the sycophants. Elena stood slightly behind him, sipping from a flute of champagne. Her eyes drifted over the crowd, cool and detached, scanning the room with the mechanical precision of a predator assessing a feeding ground. She offered a brief, dismissive nod to a junior vice president before turning her attention back to Marcus, whispering something in his ear. Marcus's laughter ceased abruptly. He nodded sharply, his jaw tight, and adjusted the gold watch on his wrist again. I remained still, a shadow against the velvet. The air in the ballroom felt heavy, suffocating, thick with the cloying scent of expensive perfume and the metallic tang of deceit. I focused on my breathing, forcing the air deep into my lungs to counteract the creeping numbness spreading through my chest. In the isolation of my cell, I had spent 5 years visualizing this precise moment. I had imagined tearing the stolen watch from Marcus's wrist and ripping the diamonds from Elena's neck until my knuckles bled. Emotion, but staring at them now, surrounded by the empire they had stolen, the fiery rage I expected was absent. In its place, a sprawling Arctic wasteland stretched across my ribs, a hollow, freezing ache where a heart used to beat. The betrayal had burned away the vulnerable, trusting core of Arthur Vance, leaving behind a machine running on cold, mechanical calculation. Marcus signaled to a waiter, snatching 2 fresh glasses of champagne from the silver tray. He handed one to Elena and raised his own high above his head. The string quartet stopped playing. The low murmur of conversation faded into an expectant hush, the silence ringing loudly in my ears. "To Arthur," Marcus called out, his voice projecting across the silent ballroom. He lowered his head, adopting an expression of profound sorrow that made my jaw clench so tightly my teeth ached. A visionary, a leader, and a brother who is deeply, profoundly missed. "To Arthur," the crowd echoed in unison, raising their glasses. Elena brought her glass to her lips, her green eyes sweeping across the room. For a fraction of a second, her gaze brushed past my shadowed corner. The temperature in my veins seemed to drop to freezing. I did not flinch. I did not look away. I simply stared back, a nameless observer in a tailored suit, letting the absolute emptiness behind my eyes meet hers. Her eyes moved on without a flicker of recognition. They raised their glasses to a dead man. I lowered my glass, the cool crystal resting heavily against my scarred jaw. The infiltration was successful. The board was set. The pieces were moving exactly as anticipated. I turned away from the celebration, slipping silently through the heavy terrace doors and out into the cool, unforgiving night air. The game had finally begun. Emotion won from. The game had begun at last, but the echo of the grand ballroom faded, replaced by the suffocating, metallic stench of damp concrete and rust that had defined my reality a full 5 years ago. The crisp night air of the terrace vanished, leaving me stranded in the memory of an 8 by 10-foot cell. The darkness pressed in from all sides, a physical weight that seemed to crush the breath from my lungs. The temperature hovered just above freezing, the chill seeping through the thin, scratching fabric of my orange jumpsuit and settling deep into my bones. I sat hunched on the edge of a steel cot, my elbows resting on my knees, my face buried in my hands. The rough, unyielding surface of the bed frame dug into my thighs, a constant, painful reminder of the absolute loss of control over my own life. My hair was still dark brown then, thick and unkempt, hanging flat over my eyes. My jaw was smooth, unmarked by the jagged scar that would in time redefine my reflection. I was Arthur Vance, the man who had built an empire from nothing, the man who believed in the unwavering loyalty of blood and the sacred bond of marriage, and I was broken. The harsh, fluorescent strip light embedded in the ceiling flickered in a steady beat, casting long, erratic shadows across the scuffed linoleum floor. The low, incessant hum of the ventilation system vibrated through the concrete walls, a maddening white noise that offered no solace. On the floor between my worn canvas shoes lay a scattering of redacted legal documents. They were copies of the final prosecution file, slipped to me earlier that day by a terrified public defender who couldn't meet my eyes. The thin, cheap paper was crumpled, the edges torn by my frantic, desperate fingers. I stared at the stark black ink on the page, the letters swimming and blurring together as a sickening, heavy nausea churned with force in my stomach. The evidence was insurmountable. The offshore accounts, the forged signatures on the transfer deeds, the damning emails detailing the systematic embezzlement of company funds. It was a perfect, airtight frame job. But the true horror, the realization that was tearing my mind apart right now, was not the prospect of a 30-year sentence. It was the irrefutable proof of who had orchestrated it. Marcus, my own brother, the man I had pulled from the gutter, the man I had entrusted with the keys to my kingdom. The emails, wiped with precision from the company servers but recovered by some miracle by the prosecution, bore his distinct, arrogant phrasing. The offshore accounts were linked to shell corporations registered under his mother's maiden name. The betrayal was so profound, so intimate, that it felt less like a legal indictment and more like a physical blade twisting with agonizing slowness between my ribs. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing the heels of my palms against my temples until bright bursts of light exploded behind my eyelids. A jagged, ragged breath tore its way up my throat, sounding more like the dying gasp of a wounded animal than a human sob. My chest heaved without control, the muscles constricting with such force I thought my ribs might snap. The damp, cold air of the cell offered no oxygen, only the suffocating reality of my total abandonment. And then there was Elena, my beautiful, brilliant wife, the woman who had promised to stand by me through any storm. Her name was plastered across the witness list, her testimony the final, devastating nail in my coffin. She had handed over my private ledgers, she had verified the forged signatures, claiming under oath that she had witnessed me signing the fraudulent documents. The sheer magnitude of the deception was incomprehensible. They had slept in my house, eaten at my table, smiled to my face, all while digging my grave with deliberate care. A violent shudder racked my frame. I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the steel cot until my knuckles turned a stark bone white. The nausea crested, rising sharp and bitter in the back of my throat. I stumbled blind toward the small stainless steel toilet in the corner of the cell, my knees hitting the freezing concrete floor with a bruising crack. I retched with violence, my stomach rejecting the meager rations I had forced down hours ago. The metallic taste of bile mixed with the coppery tang of blood as I bit down hard on the inside of my cheek. I spat into the bowl, the sound echoing hollow in the tiny space. I stayed on the floor, my cheek resting against the freezing, unforgiving steel of the toilet bowl. The cold metal offered a sharp, grounding sensation, a stark contrast to the chaotic, swirling vortex of despair consuming my mind. I lay there for what felt like hours, the flickering fluorescent light casting a sickly pallor over my pale, clammy skin. The tears came then, hot and unbidden, sliding in silence down my face and dripping onto the dirty linoleum. Emotion. I wept not for the empire I had lost, nor for the freedom that had been stripped away. I wept for the total annihilation of my faith in humanity. I wept for the man I used to be, the naive, trusting fool who had loved the vipers in his nest. With agonizing slowness, the tears stopped, the violent tremors subsiding into a deep, bone-chilling numbness. The crushing despair, the aching weight of the betrayal, began to harden. It condensed, compacting itself under immense pressure, transforming from a sprawling, chaotic grief into something infinitely more dangerous. A single distinct thought pierced through the fog of misery, sharp and clear as shattered glass. They thought I was dead, or at least as good as dead. They believed they had won. They believed they had buried Arthur Vance so deep he would never see the light of day again. I pushed myself off the freezing concrete floor, my muscles aching with an intense, unfamiliar tension. I braced my hands against the concrete wall, the rough texture scraping against my palms. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembling but holding my weight. I looked down at the scattered, crumpled legal documents on the floor. The names Marcus and Elena seemed to burn on the page, searing themselves into my retinas. The soft, trusting core of Arthur Vance had been destroyed in this 8x10 box. The man who loved his brother and cherished his wife had been brutally murdered. But as I stared at the stark concrete wall, a new sensation began to bloom in the hollow void of my chest. It wasn't warmth, it was a cold, razor-sharp clarity, an absolute, unwavering resolve. I wiped the drying blood and bile from the corner of my mouth with the back of my hand. The despair was gone. In its place, a primal, icy instinct for survival and retribution had taken root. The metamorphosis had begun. Emotion. The metamorphosis had begun in the dark. And tonight, I operated from the shadows of an abandoned warehouse, the glow of 3 massive monitors casting a pale, unnatural light across my scarred jaw. The concrete floor beneath my boots offered a stark contrast to the plush carpets of the gala I had just departed. The air in the cavernous space smelled of ozone and hot dust, a harsh, metallic scent that grounded me in the present moment. I shed the restrictive charcoal suit jacket, draping it over the back of a rusted metal folding chair, and rolled the cuffs of my crisp white shirt up to my forearms. The primary monitor displayed a cascading wall of complex code, a digital labyrinth standing between me and Marcus Vance's most guarded secrets. My fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard, the keys clicking with sharp, deliberate intent. For months, I had studied the architecture of Vance Enterprises' secure network. I mapped the firewalls, charted the encrypted pathways, and identified the microscopic vulnerabilities left behind by arrogant security contractors. Now the time for observation had passed. I initiated the first sequence. A rapid succession of command prompts flooded the secondary screen, executing a brute force assault masked behind a torrent of legitimate traffic. The cooling fans on my server tower whirred into a high-pitched scream, fighting to dissipate the immense heat generated by the processing load. I leaned forward, my eyes tracking the green text scrolling with dizzying speed. The tension in my shoulders coiled tight, a hard, physical ache radiating down my spine. The pulse in my throat hammered a rapid, heavy beat against my collar, driven by the pure, unadulterated adrenaline flooding my system. My palms began to sweat, making my fingers slip slightly on the plastic keys. I wiped them forcefully on my trousers, my breath coming in short, harsh gasps as the system struggled against Marcus's defenses. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, an animalistic drumbeat of anticipation. Marcus prided himself on his impenetrable digital fortress. He spent millions on biometric locks, rotating encryption keys, and continuous monitoring protocols. He believed his private terminal, the central hub of his stolen empire, was absolute. He was wrong. A red error message flashed on the screen. Access denied. The primary firewall had detected the intrusion attempt and initiated a lockdown protocol. A grim, hard smile touched the corner of my mouth, stretching the tight, shiny scar tissue along my jawline until it throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. The trap had sprung. I had anticipated this exact response. With a few rapid keystrokes, I deployed a ghost script, a fragmented piece of code designed to mimic a critical system failure within the firewall's own diagnostic subsystem. It sliced through the digital barriers like a hot knife through wax. The screen blinked. The red text vanished, replaced by a blinking cursor in a blank command prompt. I was inside the DMZ. The outer defenses were breached. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead, the physical toll of absolute, unwavering focus chilling my blood. It felt as if a massive physical burden had been lifted from my chest, yet the heavy weight of my vengeance still anchored me to the chair. The next layer presented a more complex challenge. A dynamic, shifting encryption matrix protected the core servers. I opened a new terminal window and ran a decryption algorithm I had acquired from a Russian contact in exchange for a substantial sum of untraceable cryptocurrency. The program chewed through the matrix, testing millions of key combinations per second. I watched the progress bar inch forward, my breath coming in slow, measured draws that burned the back of my throat. A sharp, intoxicating rush of power began to thrum through my veins, hot and electric, burning away the last lingering shadows of the man I used to be. The victim who had cowered in the freezing cell, consumed by grief and despair, was dead. In his place stood an apex predator, closing in on his prey. My lungs burned with every sharp intake of breath. The progress bar hit 100%. The screen flared a brilliant white, then settled into the clean, minimalist interface of Marcus's personal desktop. I had full administrative access. The digital kingdom was mine. I navigated through the file directories, bypassing layers of superficial security with the ease of a master thief picking a rusted lock. I bypassed the financial ledgers, the board meeting minutes, the strategic roadmaps. I was not here to steal data. I was here to send a message. I located the target, the private messaging application Marcus used to communicate with his closest corrupt associates. I opened the application. The contact list populated, a who's who of the city's power brokers and fixers. I ignored them all, selecting the direct channel to Marcus's personal device. Emotion. The cursor blinked in the text input field, waiting for my command. I rested my fingertips on the keys. The message needed to be brief, precise, and devastating. It needed to strike at the core of his paranoia, a physical blow disguised as digital text. My stomach knotted with a dark, heavy anticipation as I typed 5 words. Bile rose bitter in my throat, a physical reminder of the profound betrayal and profound loss that had shattered my life. The rage inside me was a living, breathing entity, tearing at the hollow space where my conscience used to reside. The dead do not forget. I attached a single file to the message. It was a high-resolution scan of the original, unaltered asset transfer deed, the one Elena had forged before I was framed. It was the genesis of his empire, the foundational lie upon which he had built his entire life. The file had been buried deep in the archives of a defunct legal firm, assumed lost to time and fire. Finding it had cost me a year of grueling, dangerous work, a year of sleeping with a knife under my pillow and placing absolute trust in absolutely no one. The constant fear of discovery had been a constant companion, but now it felt as though all that pain was finally bearing fruit. I hovered my finger over the enter key. The glow of the monitor reflected in the polished surface of my watch, casting a small, distorted version of my scarred face. A potent, dark satisfaction swelled in my chest, a physical pressure expanding against my ribs until it was difficult to draw breath. The pulse in my temple throbbed with a violent rhythmic ache. My muscles coiled so tight they trembled with the strain. The ghost was no longer a silent observer. The ghost had a voice. I pressed the key. The message vanished from the outbox, transmitted through encrypted channels to the device resting in Marcus Vance's pocket. I closed the application and initiated the purge protocol. A customized script wiped all trace of my intrusion, scrubbing the server logs, deleting the ghost code, and masking the breach as a routine system update glitch. Within 10 seconds, the connection severed. The screen returned to the cascading wall of code. I leaned back in the chair, running a trembling hand over the rough stubble on my jaw. In the silence of the warehouse, my blood rushed loudly in my ears, roaring with the thrill of the strike. I imagined the exact moment Marcus read the message. I pictured the color draining from his face, the sudden sharp spike of panic seizing his lungs, making him gasp for air, the frantic, terrified realization that his past had returned to collect its due. Emotion. The frantic, terrified panic that his past had returned to collect its due was Marcus's burden now. Mine was the harsh, sterile glow of the bathroom mirror, illuminating the stranger staring back at me. I stood before the sink in my safe house, the cold porcelain pressing sharp against my waist. The air in the small room carried the sharp chemical scent of antiseptic and stale coffee, a stark contrast to the metallic tang of the server racks I had just left behind. Water dripped from the rusted faucet with a slow, steady rhythm, each hollow splash echoing against the cracked tile walls. I leaned closer to the glass, resting my damp palms on the edge of the sink. The face reflected in the mirror belonged to a dead man. Or rather, it belonged to a man who had been meticulously forged from the ashes of Arthur Vance. My hair, once dark and neatly trimmed, was now a pale ash grey cut close to the scalp. Deep lines etched themselves around my eyes, weathering my features with an artificial age that mirrored the genuine ache deep within my bones. But the most prominent feature, the undeniable centerpiece of the metamorphosis, was the jagged, shiny scar slicing down my jawline. It traced a raised, uneven path from my ear to my chin, the taut skin pulling at the corner of my mouth. I traced the line of the scar with my index finger, the rough texture a physical anchor to the sheer magnitude of my loss. The pain of the prison beating that caused it had faded long ago, replaced by a cold, absolute detachment. The man who had screamed in agony on that concrete floor, consumed by the devastating betrayal of his own flesh and blood, was gone. I turned away from the mirror and walked into the main living area. The wooden floorboards creaked under my weight, the sound harsh in the absolute silence of the apartment. I crossed the room to a small, scarred metal table sitting beneath a single, naked light bulb. On the table lay a thick manila envelope, heavily sealed with industrial tape. It contained the final pieces of the puzzle. It contained Victor Thorne. I picked up a steel letter opener and sliced through the tape. The harsh tearing sound grated against my ears. I upended the envelope, letting the contents spill onto the metal surface. A passport, a driver's license, social security cards, and a collection of immaculate financial records scattered under the harsh yellow light. I picked up the passport, the dark blue cover stiff and brand new. I flipped it open to the photo page. The man in the photograph looked exactly like the stranger in the mirror. Ash-grey hair, weathered skin, a prominent facial scar, and a gaze as cold and unforgiving as shattered ice. The name printed next to the photo was Victor Thorne. Date of birth, place of origin, travel history. Every single detail had been fabricated with flawless precision. I ran my thumb over the raised seal, the physical proof of my new existence grounding me. The weight of the documents in my hand was immense, far heavier than the paper they were printed on. They represented years of grueling preparation, countless hours spent erasing Arthur Vance from the digital world and meticulously constructing Victor Thorne in his place. It had cost me the last remnants of my humanity, replacing my innate capacity for trust and love with a hollow, razor-sharp focus on retribution. I picked up the driver's license, the glossy plastic catching the light. The address listed was a high-end condominium in the financial district, a location chosen specifically for its proximity to Vance Enterprise headquarters. I had secured the lease through a complex web of offshore shell companies, ensuring Victor Thorne's paper trail was impenetrable. I traced the raised lettering of the name, the physical action solidifying the transition in my mind. The rage that had once burned so fiercely inside me, a chaotic, consuming inferno of grief and despair, had cooled into something infinitely more dangerous. It was no longer a fire. It was a glacier. It was an icy, calculated malice that drove every single decision, every single action. The emotional burden of the betrayal still resided deep in my chest, a dark, heavy mass, but it no longer controlled me. I controlled it. It was the fuel that powered the machine. I set the driver's license down next to the passport and picked up the financial documents, bank statements, investment portfolios, tax returns, a complete verifiable financial history that painted Victor Thorne as a wealthy, reclusive investor looking to enter the local market. The numbers on the pages were staggering, a testament to the untraceable cryptocurrency I had amassed during my years in the shadows. It was the capital I needed to dismantle Marcus's empire piece by piece. I sorted the documents into precise, orderly piles, aligning the edges with meticulous care. The process was almost meditative, the repetitive motions soothing the lingering adrenaline from the cyber intrusion. Emotion. The air in the room grew cold, the draft from the poorly sealed window raising goosebumps on my forearms, but I barely registered the chill. The physical discomfort was irrelevant. The only thing that mattered was the objective. I pulled a chair out from the table, the metal legs scraping harshly against the wooden floorboards. I sat down, my back straight, my posture rigid. I looked at the collection of forged documents, the tangible proof of my new reality. The soft, trusting core of Arthur Vance had been ripped away, leaving behind a hollow shell that had been filled with cold, calculating vengeance. I picked up a pen from the table, the smooth metal cool against my skin. I pulled a blank piece of paper from a nearby stack and wrote the name Victor Thorne. The ink flowed smooth and dark across the page. I wrote it again and again, practicing the signature until the sharp, angular letters flowed from my hand with effortless precision. It was not a forgery. It was a declaration of existence. The transformation was absolute. The reconciliation between the physical scars and the fabricated documents was complete. The past, with all its sorrow and shame, was locked away behind a wall of impenetrable ice. The game had begun, and the opening move had been executed with flawless precision. Marcus was bleeding, and he did not even know the identity of the ghost holding the knife. I laid the pen down on the table, the click echoing in the silent room. The dead do not forget. And Victor Thorne was about to remind them exactly what they had buried: emotion. "It was a pleasure to finally meet you in person," Marcus said, his handshake firm but his palms slick with a desperate sweat that betrayed his arrogant smile. I stood in the center of his expansive, glass-walled office, the panoramic view of the city skyline stretching out behind him. The air in the room was cold, heavily conditioned to preserve the expensive, exotic orchids lining the windowsill. I returned the handshake, my grip steady and unyielding. The physical contact sent a sharp, electric jolt of pure rage straight to my core. Bile rose bitter in the back of my throat, a visceral reaction to the proximity of the man who had stolen my life. I swallowed hard, forcing the dark, heavy mass of my fury deep into my chest, locking it behind a flawless mask of wealthy affability. "The pleasure is mine," I replied, my voice a low, gravelly rasp that bore no resemblance to the smooth baritone of my past. I withdrew my hand and took a seat in one of the plush leather chairs opposite his massive mahogany desk. The chair was new, a recent addition, but the desk was the exact same one I had purchased 10 years ago. A hollow ache bloomed in my ribs as I recognized the small, intricate carving near the edge. I remembered the day it arrived. I remembered the pride I had felt building this place. Marcus settled into his high-backed executive chair, leaning back with practiced confidence. He wore a bespoke Italian suit that hung perfectly from his frame, a heavy gold watch flashing on his wrist. To the untrained eye, he looked like a titan of industry at the peak of his power, but I knew him better than anyone. I saw the faint, dark circles beneath his eyes. I noticed the slight, almost imperceptible tremble in his fingers as he adjusted his silk tie. He was bleeding capital, his reckless expansions and extravagant lifestyle draining the company dry. The digital message I had sent him the night before had undoubtedly accelerated his panic, but right now, his immediate crisis was cash flow. "Your intermediaries were quite insistent on a face-to-face meeting," Marcus began, steepling his fingers. Given the staggering size of the proposed capital injection, I agreed. However, I must admit, your profile is exceptionally discreet. A ghost in the financial markets. I value privacy, I said, keeping my posture relaxed, my legs crossed at the ankle. A freezing, analytical calm settled over my nerves as I held his gaze. In my experience, loud money attracts unwanted parasites. I prefer to operate from the shadows, striking only when the opportunity is absolute. Marcus offered a tight, forced chuckle, the sound hollow and devoid of genuine amusement. A philosophy I can appreciate. Vance Enterprise is poised for global expansion, but the current economic climate demands liquidity. An injection of your magnitude would accelerate our roadmap by a decade. I am aware of your roadmap, I said, leaning forward slightly, letting the ambient light from the floor-to-ceiling windows catch the pale, jagged scar on my jawline. Marcus's eyes flicked to the disfigurement for a fraction of a second before darting back to my face. The subtle flinch did not escape me. But I am also aware of the structural vulnerabilities in your recent acquisitions. You have overextended, leaving your core assets exposed. I am not a philanthropist. I am an apex predator. I require absolute assurance that my investment will yield dominant returns. Marcus's jaw tightened, the muscles flexing beneath his skin. The insult stung his pride, a vulnerability I knew intimately. Our core assets are impenetrable, he stated, his voice defensive. He gestured vaguely to a large framed portrait hanging on the far wall. It was a painting of me, Arthur Vance, though the artist had softened the features, making me look tragic and saintly. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of blinding rage through my veins, but I kept my breathing slow and measured, my expression an unreadable slab of stone. Our founder, Marcus continued, his tone adopting a rehearsed somber reverence that made my stomach churn with violent disgust. My dear brother established a formidable foundation. It was a tragedy, his passing, a devastating loss for the family and the industry. But his vision was limited. It required a bold hand to transition the company into a modern empire. I have provided that hand. The sheer audacity of the lie was a physical blow, a heavy weight pressing down on my lungs until I had to force myself to inhale. He had murdered his brother, stolen his legacy, and now he used his ghost as a marketing tool to court investors. The betrayal was a living, breathing entity in the room, suffocating in its intensity. I wondered how he managed to sleep at night. I wondered if he ever saw my face in the dark. Indeed, I murmured, my voice devoid of inflection. A tragic loss. But the market has no memory for grief. It only respects power, emotion. Your brother's foundation is solid, but your execution lacks discipline. I am offering the discipline. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket and withdrew a single crisp manila folder. I placed it on the mahogany desk and slid it across the polished surface. These are the preliminary terms, a $300 million injection, structured across 4 quarters. In exchange, I require a controlling interest in your international logistics division and a permanent seat on the executive board. Marcus stared at the folder as if it were a live explosive. The sheer volume of the capital offered was enough to salvage his crumbling empire, but the terms were draconian. He picked up the folder, his hands trembling slightly, and opened the cover. His eyes scanned the pages, the desperate greed warring with his innate paranoia. A board seat is highly unusual for an external investor, Marcus hedged, closing the folder but keeping his hand rested firmly on top of it. He was hooked. The desperation in his eyes was a profound, intoxicating validation of my strategy. I am not an external investor, I replied, standing up slowly, towering over him. The air crackled with unspoken tension. If we proceed, I will be a foundational pillar of this enterprise. You need my capital to survive the coming storm. I need a vehicle for my ambitions. We are perfectly aligned. I turned and walked toward the glass doors, my footsteps silent on the thick carpet. I paused at the threshold, looking back over my shoulder. Marcus was still staring at the folder, the heavy gold watch catching the afternoon light. He looked small, pathetic, and entirely consumed by his own impending ruin. Review the terms, I instructed, my tone flat, projecting an icy detachment that masked the roaring inferno of vengeance in my soul. You have 48 hours. Do not attempt to renegotiate. The offer is absolute. I stepped out of the office, the heavy doors clicking shut behind me, sealing the trap. The game had escalated, the pieces falling precisely into place. The dead do not forget, and the ghost had just walked through the front door. Emotion, the ghost had just walked through the front door of Vance Enterprise. But 4 years ago, in the suffocating darkness of my prison cell, that ghost was born from the harsh glare of a contraband flashlight, illuminating a single forged signature. The air in the maximum security wing was thick, carrying the permanent metallic stench of sweat, rust, and unwashed bodies. It was 3 in the morning. The guard patrols had settled into their predictable, lazy rhythm, leaving the cell block bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the emergency lights. I sat cross-legged on the thin, lumpy mattress of my steel cot, a heavy woolen blanket draped over my head to conceal the beam of a small, battery-operated penlight clamped between my teeth. My hair was still dark brown then, grown long and unkempt, brushing against my collar. My jaw remained smooth, untouched by the brutal violence that would eventually claim it. But the naivety of Arthur Vance was already dying, bleeding out onto the pages of the heavily redacted legal files scattered across my lap. Obtaining the unredacted appendices of the prosecution's case had cost me 6 months of smuggled cigarettes and a dangerous alliance with an inmate working in the warden's office. I shifted my weight, the metal springs of the cot groaning loudly in protest. The sound was deafening in the absolute silence, sending a sharp spike of pure adrenaline straight to my core. I held my breath, listening intently for the heavy thud of a guard's boot. Nothing, only the distant rhythmic dripping of a leaky pipe down the corridor. I exhaled, my breath coming in a short, harsh rasp, and returned my focus to the documents. For weeks, I had meticulously cross-referenced the financial ledgers with the prosecution's timeline. The official narrative claimed I had systematically siphoned millions from Vance Enterprise into offshore shell accounts. The evidence relied heavily on a series of asset transfer deeds, all bearing my authorization. The prosecution had presented copies. I now held the high-resolution scans of the originals. I picked up the key document, the transfer of the primary logistics hub to a holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. I traced the beam of the penlight down to the signature block. To the casual observer, the ink formed the distinct, aggressive loops of Arthur Vance. But I was not a casual observer. I stared at the stark black ink on the page, the letters swimming in the dim light. A sickening, heavy nausea churned violently in my stomach, a physical manifestation of the profound betrayal unfolding before my eyes. The loop of the V was too rounded. The cross of the T lacked the sharp, downward slash I always used. And the pressure, the pen had dug too deeply into the paper on the upstroke, a telltale sign of someone carefully drawing the letters rather than writing them fluidly. It was a forgery, a masterful, incredibly precise forgery, but a fake nonetheless. My hands began to tremble, the paper shaking rapidly in the narrow beam of light. I flipped to the notary stamp at the bottom of the page. The date was April 14th. I closed my eyes, pressing the heels of my palms against my temples until bright bursts of light exploded behind my eyelids. The ache in my head was a dull, relentless throb. I remembered April 14th. I had been in Tokyo, negotiating a semiconductor supply chain. I had not been in the country to sign anything. I opened my eyes and flipped to the witness testimony appendix. My lungs burned with every sharp intake of breath. I found the page detailing the verification of the signature. The words on the page were a physical blow, striking with the blunt force of a hammer. I, Elena Vance, hereby testify under oath that I was present in the executive office on April 14th and personally witnessed Arthur Vance sign the enclosed asset transfer documentation. The penlight slipped from my mouth, clattering loudly against the steel bedframe. The light spiraled across the concrete wall before settling on the floor, casting long, erratic shadows. The darkness rushed in, pressing down on my chest with the crushing weight of a collapsing building. I could not draw a full breath. The walls of the cell seemed to shrink, closing in on me like a vice. Elena, my brilliant, beautiful wife. The woman who had sworn to stand by me. The woman who had cried in the courtroom as the judge handed down my sentence. It wasn't just Marcus who had orchestrated my downfall. They had done it together. I scrambled off the mattress, my knees hitting the freezing concrete floor with a bruising crack. The cold seared through the thin fabric of my jumpsuit, but the physical discomfort was entirely irrelevant compared to the raging inferno of grief consuming my mind. I leaned heavily against the stainless steel toilet, the metal biting into my skin. A violent shudder racked my frame. The profound disgust was a living entity in my throat, tasting of bile and ash. They had not simply removed a business rival. They had systematically dismantled a man who loved them. The trust I had placed in Elena was an absolute fundamental truth of my existence. Finding her perjury was like discovering a fatal toxin coursing through my own veins. The hollow space in my chest expanded, a vast echoing void of despair that threatened to swallow me whole. I dry-heaved over the bowl, my stomach muscles constricting with agonizing force, but there was nothing left to expel. I slumped against the damp concrete wall, sliding down until I sat on the freezing floor. The penlight still shone from under the bed, a single weak beam of truth cutting through the pervasive darkness. The man who had walked into this prison, still clinging to a desperate hope that his family would fight for his appeal, died on that floor. The soft, trusting core of Arthur Vance was entirely annihilated, burned away by the acid of their deceit. I stared at the shadows dancing on the wall, my pulse hammering a slow, heavy rhythm in my ears. The raw, bleeding wound of the betrayal began to cauterize. The sorrow hardened into a dark, impenetrable shell. The rage, once chaotic and blinding, crystallized into an icy, calculated malice. They had stolen my company. They had stolen my freedom. But worst of all, they had made me love the vipers that poisoned me. I reached out and pulled the penlight from beneath the bed. I gathered the scattered documents from the mattress, stacking them with precise, deliberate care. The shivering had stopped. The panic had receded. What remained was a profound, absolute clarity. The dead do not forget. And standing in the shadows of the warehouse 4 years later, Victor Thorne was the direct consequence of the murder they committed in this cell. Emotion, the direct consequence of their betrayal, leaned forward in the plush leather chair, tapping a heavy gold pen against the labyrinthine investment contract that would inevitably strip Marcus Vance of his entire empire. We were seated in the same penthouse boardroom where I had once negotiated the acquisitions that built Vance Enterprise. The air was thick with the rich aroma of expensive espresso, mingling with the sharp, metallic tang of the sheer desperation radiating from across the mahogany table. Marcus sat rigidly, his expensive suit doing little to hide the rapid, anxious rise and fall of his chest. I pushed the thick, leather-bound dossier an inch closer to him. The motion was slow, deliberate, projecting an absolute, contemptuous superiority. A freezing, analytical calm had completely replaced the chaotic rage that once ruled me. I watched him with the detached fascination of a biologist observing a frantic insect caught in a jar. The structure of the Apollo initiative is undeniably complex, I said, my voice smooth and devoid of any inflection. It is designed to be. We are utilizing a network of offshore trusts to funnel the capital injection through a series of rapid-yield synthetic collateralized debt obligations. It maximizes the initial cash flow while minimizing your immediate tax burden. Marcus dragged his eyes up from the pages, the dark circles under them more pronounced in the harsh midday light pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked exhausted, burdened by the immense weight of the crumbling empire he had stolen. A $300 million injection, he repeated, his voice tight. But the collateral requirements. Victor, you are asking me to leverage the intellectual property rights of our core logistics algorithm. That is the beating heart of Vance Enterprise. I leaned back, resting my hands on the armrests. The cool leather provided a grounding sensation against my palms. I did not blink. I did not offer a reassuring smile. I am not asking for a favor, Marcus. I am offering you a lifeline. The market is contracting. Your recent ventures have hemorrhaged capital. The simple fact is, you do not have the liquidity to survive another fiscal quarter. The Apollo initiative guarantees immediate solvency. I watched the muscles in his jaw clench, a physical manifestation of his profound fear. He was terrified of losing the power he had sacrificed his own brother to obtain. The profound disgust I harbored for him was a heavy, hollow ache in my chest, a constant reminder of the profound loss that had birthed Victor Thorne. He had traded a sacred trust for a fleeting illusion of grandeur. The algorithm is our most secure asset, Marcus argued, tapping a manicured fingernail against the table. The slight tremor in his hand was undeniable. If the synthetic CDOs underperform, the collateral transfer clause is absolute. I would be handing you the keys to the kingdom. If you do not accept the capital, there will be no kingdom left to rule, I countered, the words striking with the blunt force of a physical blow. The intellectual triumph singing in my veins was intoxicating. I had spent years analyzing his psychological profile, mapping his insecurities, understanding the exact nature of his greed. He was a gambler who could not accept a loss, perpetually doubling down in a desperate bid to maintain the facade. The contract before him was a perfectly engineered snare, designed specifically for a man blinded by his own arrogance. I picked up the espresso cup, taking a slow sip. The bitter liquid burned pleasantly down my throat. The financial models are robust, I continued, setting the cup down with a soft, final clink. The risk profile is entirely manageable for an executive with your visionary capabilities. You claimed you wanted to transition the company into a modern empire. This is the mechanism. Marcus stared at the document, the silence stretching taut across the room. He was suffocating under the weight of his own terrible decisions. He was desperate for a savior, and he had invited the executioner into his sanctuary. The irony was so sharp it tasted like blood in the back of my throat. He flipped to the final page, his eyes locking onto the signature line. The same line where Elena had forged my name 4 years ago, signing away my life. The board will require a detailed briefing, Marcus said, his voice dropping to a low conspiratorial whisper. It was the sound of a man rationalizing his own destruction. They will balk at leveraging the algorithm. The board will follow your lead, provided you present it as an aggressive expansion strategy, I instructed, my tone commanding. I was no longer pitching. I was dictating the terms of his surrender. You are the CEO. You must project absolute certainty, emotion. If you show them the despair that is currently written across your face, they will tear you apart like a pack of starving wolves. He flinched, the harsh truth piercing the armor of his vanity. The shame coloring his cheeks was a brief, dark flush. He hated me in that moment, but his greed was stronger than his pride. It always had been. I will need 24 hours to run the projections through my own risk analysts, Marcus said, a pathetic attempt to retain a semblance of control over the situation. You have 12, I replied, standing up in a smooth, fluid motion. I buttoned my suit jacket, towering over him. The physical dominance was a calculated maneuver, emphasizing the absolute shift in power. The capital is ready for deployment. The synthetic instruments are primed, but the window of opportunity is narrow. I do not wait, Marcus. I turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors, the thick carpet muffling my footsteps. I could feel his eyes burning into my back, a frantic mix of resentment and desperate hope. He was a rat trapped in a maze of his own design, entirely oblivious to the fact that the walls were rapidly closing in. I stepped out into the bright, sterile hallway of the executive suite, a cold, sharp smile finally breaking across my scarred jaw. The trap was set. The bait was taken. The total annihilation of Marcus Vance was now only a matter of time. Emotion. The total annihilation of Marcus Vance was now only a matter of time. But the true test awaited me under the blinding crystal chandeliers of the Grand Symphony Hall, where the sharp scent of expensive jasmine perfume assaulted my senses. The annual charity gala was a glittering display of the city's elite, a sea of tailored tuxedos and designer gowns swirling around the polished marble foyer. I stood near the edge of the grand staircase, holding a crystal flute of champagne, my posture rigid and my expression an impenetrable mask of wealthy indifference. The ambient noise of 100 overlapping conversations echoed off the vaulted ceiling, but my focus remained locked on a single figure across the room. Elena Vance held court near the main ballroom entrance. She wore a stunning emerald green gown that accentuated her slender figure, a diamond necklace sparkling against her collarbone. She was laughing softly, her manicured hand resting lightly on the arm of a prominent city councilman. She played the role of the grieving philanthropic widow with flawless precision, a dangerous, intoxicating siren drawing the unwary into her orbit. I took a slow, measured sip of the champagne. The vintage was excellent, crisp and dry, yet it tasted like ash on my tongue. The woman across the room was the architect of my destruction. She was the one who had forged my signature, the one who had perjured herself on the witness stand, the one who had condemned me to rot in a concrete box while she inherited the world I built. The profound betrayal should have ignited a roaring fire of rage within me, but instead I found only a vast, echoing emotional void. The man who had loved her, the man who had trusted her with his life and legacy, was entirely gone. In his place stood an apex predator, studying his prey. I set the half-empty flute on a passing waiter's tray and moved through the crowd. The patrons parted for me instinctively, sensing the cold, quiet authority radiating from my tailored suit and the prominent, jagged scar slicing down my jaw. I stopped 3 paces away from her, waiting patiently for the councilman to finish his anecdote. When he finally laughed and turned away, Elena shifted her gaze toward me. Her eyes, a striking, vibrant hazel, met mine. For a fraction of a second, the polite, practiced smile faltered. A microscopic tension tightened the muscles around her mouth. A sudden, instinctual hesitation that thrilled me down to the marrow of my bones. She did not recognize Arthur Vance in the scarred, ash-haired stranger standing before her, but some primal instinct deep within her recognized the danger. "Good evening," I said, my voice a low, gravelly rasp that easily cut through the ambient chatter. I offered a slight, formal bow. "The gala is a resounding success. You have outdone yourself." Elena recovered instantly, the professional charm sliding back into place like a well-oiled vault door. "Thank you. It is a cause very close to my heart. I do not believe we have been formally introduced." "I am the primary benefactor for the Apollo Initiative," I replied, keeping my eyes locked onto hers, searching for any ripple of recognition beneath the surface. "We are currently engaged in significant financial restructuring with your brother-in-law." Her eyes widened slightly, the mention of the massive capital injection clearly piquing her opportunistic interest. "Ah, the elusive investor Marcus has been raving about. It is a profound honor to finally meet you. I am Elena Vance." She extended her hand. I reached out and clasped her long, delicate fingers. Her skin was warm, the diamond ring, the one I had placed on that finger 10 years ago, pressing hard against my palm. A deep, heavy ache throbbed rhythmically in my chest, a phantom pain from a severed limb, but I kept my grip firm and my expression completely blank. I was a ghost holding the hand of my murderer. "The Vance name carries significant weight in this city," I remarked, withdrawing my hand and clasping my hands behind my back. "The foundation your family built is formidable." Elena's smile turned soft, a calculated display of manufactured sorrow. She lowered her gaze perfectly, the very picture of tragic devotion. "It is a heavy burden carrying on the legacy. My late husband built this empire from nothing. He was a visionary, a brilliant mind. The sheer audacity of the lie was staggering, a physical pressure expanding against my ribs. She wore the grief like a designer accessory, a tool to manipulate and disarm." "Indeed," I murmured, my voice flat. "The market often demands ruthless sacrifices. I understand your late husband encountered legal difficulties before his untimely passing." Elena sighed, a delicate, practiced sound of despair. "Poor Arthur. He was a brilliant architect, but he lacked the moral fortitude to navigate the true complexities of the financial world. The ambition consumed him. It was a devastating tragedy, watching him lose his way." She looked back up at me, her hazel eyes shimmering with unshed, fabricated tears. The absolute lack of shame was a profound validation of the vengeance I sought. The hollow space inside me expanded, an emotional void completely devoid of the love I once held for her. "My love for him never wavered," Elena continued, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Even at the very end, I tried to save him from himself. But some men are simply destined to destroy everything they touch." "A poignant observation," I replied, a freezing, analytical calm settling over my entire being. I leaned in slightly, closing the physical distance between us. The scent of her jasmine perfume was overpowering, a toxic cloud that I inhaled without flinching. "I have found that the past is rarely what it seems. The truth has a remarkable way of surviving the fire, waiting for the perfect moment to emerge from the ashes." Elena's breath hitched, the slightest intake of air. The polite smile froze on her lips, her eyes scanning my face with sudden, sharp intensity. The instinctual fear had returned, a shadow passing over her features. She looked at the scar on my jaw, then up to my eyes, searching for something she could not quite name. "If you will excuse me," she said, her voice tight, the charming facade cracking for the first time all evening. "I must attend to the silent auction." "Of course," I said, stepping aside with a polite nod. "Enjoy the evening, Mrs. Vance." I watched her walk away, her pace slightly too fast, the elegant line of her spine rigid with tension. The encounter had been a flawless execution. I had probed the defenses and found them vulnerable. The grief she peddled to the public was a lie, but the terror I had just planted in her heart was absolutely real. The game was accelerating, and the queen was finally on the board. Emotion, With the Queen finally on the board, I bypassed the biometric scanners of the executive suite, the cold, heavy, sharp metal of Arthur Vance's monogrammed pen resting firmly against my rough palm. The security protocols of Vance Enterprise were a formidable digital labyrinth of retinal scans, biometric checkpoints, and encrypted keycards. Marcus had spent millions fortifying his stolen kingdom, driven by a gnawing paranoia that grew more desperate with every passing year. I had retained the master access codes, waiting for the perfect moment to exploit the blind spot. The architecture of this security grid was something I had personally commissioned a decade ago, long before the betrayal had shattered my world. The corridor leading to the primary executive office was completely deserted. The ambient lighting was a soft, sterile glow, reflecting perfectly off the smooth, hard marble floor. I moved with deliberate, measured steps, my posture entirely relaxed despite the immense risk. A sharp, electric thrill of sadistic anticipation buzzed through my warm veins, pushing aside the lingering ache of my past. The metallic hum of the central air conditioning effectively masked the soft rustle of my tailored wool suit. The absolute silence echoed down the long hallway, a profound, heavy silence broken only by the faint, rhythmic thud of my leather shoes. It felt as though the entire building was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable execution. I paused before the massive double oak doors that guarded the inner sanctum. The digital keypad next to the heavy brass handle emitted a dim red flicker, signaling the active lockdown state. I reached into my coat pocket and withdrew a small, highly modified smartphone. The smooth glass screen was cold to the touch. I initiated an override script I had written during my long nights in the damp, dusty warehouse, surrounded by the stale scent of smoke and ash. The phone transmitted a rapid burst of concentrated radio frequencies, specifically targeting the magnetic lock. The keypad blinked a bright, steady green. The heavy lock disengaged with a loud, satisfying click. It sounded like a sudden crackle of thunder in the quiet space, a definitive breach of his fortress. I pushed the heavy oak doors open and stepped into the expansive office. The room was exactly as I had left it yesterday, the massive mahogany desk dominating the center of the space. The late afternoon sun cast long, dark shadows across the expensive Persian rug, a bright glare illuminating the dust motes dancing lazily in the air. I closed the heavy doors silently behind me, the latch catching with a soft snick. The air was perfectly still, holding the faint metallic scent of expensive perfume, stale sweat, and sharp fear. I walked toward the desk, the soft, thick carpet completely absorbing the heavy thud of my footsteps. My heart hammered a steady rhythm against my ribs, driven by a pure manipulative joy that surged through me like an electric current. The vulnerability of his position was a staggering validation of my entire strategy. I stood behind his high-backed leather chair, looking down at the smooth, polished surface of the desk. There were no loose papers. Marcus kept his workspace obsessively clean. A silver, leather-bound daily planner sat precisely aligned with the sharp edge of the wood. I reached into my inner pocket and retrieved the fountain pen. It was crafted from solid platinum with a distinctive gold nib that would gleam and flash in the bright light of morning. It was the exact pen I used to sign the genuine contracts, and it was the pen Elena had modeled her masterful forgery upon. I held the pen up to the sunlight, the platinum catching the harsh glare and throwing a piercing reflection across the silent room. The object carried an immense crushing weight, heavily saturated with the bitter memories of a shattered trust and an unimaginable betrayal. But today, it was a weapon. I placed the pen directly on top of the silver daily planner. The metallic click echoed softly in the cavernous office. The stark contrast of the bright platinum against the dark, soft leather was a visual scream that could not be ignored. I took a step back, surveying the arrangement with profound satisfaction. The sadistic joy blooming in my chest was a roaring fire that burned away the last remnants of my hollow despair. When Marcus arrived tomorrow morning, he would stare at a ghost manifesting in the physical world. The impenetrable walls of his fortress would crumble instantly. He would gasp for air, choking on the fear of his own past. The psychological torture of not knowing how it got there would slowly drive him insane. I did not touch anything else in the room. I did not attempt to access his terminal. The visual message was far more devastating than any corporate espionage. It was a declaration of absolute dominance. Emotion, the we thinks, was far more devastating than any corporate espionage. It was a declaration of absolute dominance, emotion that we thinks was far more devastating than any corporate espionage. It was a declaration of absolute dominance. The dead do not forgive, and they certainly do not remain buried in the cold ash. I turned and walked back toward the heavy doors. I re-engaged the lock, ensuring the room appeared completely undisturbed. I stepped back out into the sterile hallway, slipping the phone back into my pocket. I adjusted my stiff cuffs, a cold, sharp smile fixed on my rough, scarred features, and walked toward the elevator. The trap was armed, the bait was lethal. The lethal bait had been taken, and now, bathed in the sharp, bright glare of my server racks, I prepared to spring the trap on Marcus's hidden offshore accounts. The abandoned warehouse was a cavern of deep, impenetrable shadows, illuminated only by the dim blue glow radiating from the heavy monitors. The silence in the massive space was an illusion, constantly broken by the loud, metallic roar of the heavy cooling fans fighting to dissipate the intense heat. The air held the stale, damp scent of old dust and the sharp, metallic tang of burning ozone. I sat in a rough, hard metal chair, my fingers resting lightly on the cold, smooth plastic of the keyboard. A profound, ruthless efficiency had entirely replaced the chaotic rage that once ruled me. I was no longer a victim consumed by a devastating betrayal. I was a surgeon, preparing to excise a cancerous tumor with absolute precision. I tapped a series of commands, the heavy, sharp click of the mechanical keys echoing loudly off the cold concrete walls. Marcus believed his Cayman Island accounts were completely invisible. He had routed his personal wealth through a labyrinth of shell companies, burying the digital paper trail beneath layers of heavy encryption. But the architecture of that banking network was built on a foundational algorithm I had designed 10 years ago. It was a masterpiece of financial routing, built on an absolute trust I once held for the company. Now, I weaponized that intimate knowledge against him. I initiated the Cascade protocol. The primary monitor flashed a bright, blinding white before settling into a rapid cascade of scrolling green code. The network defenses were formidable, deploying a barrage of aggressive countermeasures designed to trace and isolate any unauthorized intrusion. I watched the system attempt to lock onto my proxy servers, the digital equivalent of a frantic, blind stare in the dark. I deployed a specialized ghost script, a fragmented anomaly I had coded during long, hollow nights surrounded by the smell of cold smoke and ash. The script mimicked a routine, high-level administrative audit. The bank's security subroutines, recognizing the familiar heavy signature of the core algorithm, immediately stood down. A soft, rhythmic hum vibrated through the metal desk, matching the slow, heavy thud of my own heartbeat. The screen blinked, the green text vanishing. In its place, the clean, sterile interface of Marcus Vance's private portfolio appeared. The numbers were staggering. Millions of dollars, stolen from the legitimate operations of Vance Enterprise, siphoned away to fund his extravagant, arrogant lifestyle while the core business slowly starved. The sight of those numbers brought a fresh, sharp ache to my ribs, a physical reminder of the profound loss I had endured. But I pushed the sorrow aside, letting a grim, dark satisfaction take control. I opened a secondary terminal window and linked it to a network of untraceable shell accounts I had established in Singapore and Zurich. These accounts were digital ghosts, completely insulated from international oversight. I typed the transfer command, my fingers flying across the keys with a frantic, trembling energy. I did not initiate a single massive withdrawal. That would trigger a manual review and an immediate lockdown. Instead, I executed a microtransaction script. The program began to systematically drain the offshore accounts, moving small, randomized amounts of capital at a dizzying speed. $1,000 here, $5,000 there, 10,000 routed through a dummy corporation in Panama before settling in a Swiss vault. The monitor became a blur of flashing numbers, a silent, deadly waterfall of stolen wealth cascading away from Marcus Vance. I leaned closer to the screen, the bright glare burning into my retinas. The sweat on my forehead was cold and slick, a stark contrast to the warm, heavy air blowing from the server exhaust fans. The sheer scale of the operation was intoxicating. I was systematically dismantling his entire safety net, tearing away the financial armor he relied upon. The fear he would experience when he discovered the empty accounts would be absolute, a crushing, suffocating weight that would break his fragile psyche. The progress bar inched toward completion. The roar of the cooling fans seemed to reach a deafening crescendo, a mechanical symphony of destruction. I wiped my rough, scarred jaw with the back of my hand, the harsh stubble scraping loudly against my skin. The profound guilt that had once haunted me, the sickening shame of allowing them to destroy my legacy, evaporated completely. I was reclaiming what was rightfully mine. The final transaction executed. The screen flared a bright, solid green. Transfer complete. The offshore accounts were entirely empty. The vast fortune Marcus had accumulated through perjury and murder was gone, dispersed into a digital void he could never access. Emotion, the sudden silence that followed the transfer's completion, was heavy and profound, broken only by the steady, rhythmic rustle of the wind against the warehouse roof. I leaned back in the cold, hard chair, exhaling a long, slow breath. The tension drained from my muscles, leaving behind a deep, hollow exhaustion. I reached out and triggered the purge protocol. A soft crackle echoed from the speakers as the system scrubbed all trace of the intrusion, burning the digital bridge I had just crossed. I watched the connection sever, the screen fading to a dim, quiet black. The trap had sprung, the jaws snapping shut with lethal force. Marcus Vance was officially bankrupt, and the true nightmare had only just begun. The true nightmare had only just begun for Marcus Vance. But for me, it was born 2 years ago from the sharp, coppery taste of my own warm blood, staining the rough concrete of the prison yard. The afternoon sun beat down with a relentless, blinding glare, baking the exercise yard into a stifling oven. The heavy, damp air carried the overpowering scent of stale sweat, metallic dust, and the distant, acrid smell of burning trash from the incinerator. I stood near the high chain-link fence, the hard wire digging into my spine, seeking a rare patch of dim shadow. My dark hair clung to my forehead, soaked in warm sweat. 2 years into my sentence, the initial shock of Elena and Marcus's betrayal had long since hardened into a cold, heavy burden of absolute despair and hollow grief. But I still clung to a fragile, pathetic hope that my appeals would expose their perjury. I still possessed a fundamental morality, a line I refused to cross. That line was about to be violently erased. The ambient roar of 300 shouting inmates provided a chaotic symphony that masked the approaching danger. I watched a group of 4 men detach themselves from the weight piles, their heavy work boots thudding against the concrete. The leader was a massive, scarred enforcer serving life for armed robbery. I knew him only as Rook. He held a rolled-up magazine tightly in his large, rough hand. The soft rustle of the paper concealed the sharp gleam of a jagged, rusted piece of metal protruding from one end. A shiv. My heart hammered a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. A sudden, cold spike of primal fear pierced the hollow ache in my chest. I pushed off the hard fence, my sneakers scraping loudly against the ground. The 4 men fanned out, moving with a coordinated, predatory grace that cut off my escape routes toward the guard towers. The guards were suspiciously absent from their posts along the northern wall. Marcus had reached into the prison. His wealth had bought my silence, and now it was buying my execution. "Vance sends his regards," Rook hissed, the cruel whisper barely audible over the roaring crowd. He lunged. The movement was a blur of violence. I twisted my torso, but the rusted metal flashed in the bright sunlight, catching the side of my face. A sharp, searing agony ripped through my jawline, from my ear down to my chin. The hot spray of my own blood painted the front of my grey jumpsuit. A loud, wet thud echoed in my ears as his heavy fist followed the blade, striking my temple with the force of a swinging hammer. I hit the rough, hot concrete hard, my vision exploding into a chaotic flicker of blinding white and deep black shadows. The taste of copper and ash flooded my mouth. I gasped for air, the breath tearing through my throat like broken glass. A heavy boot kicked me in the ribs, the sharp crack of bone sending a fresh wave of blinding pain through my body. The profound, suffocating weight of impending death pressed down upon me. They were not going to stop. The soft, trusting core of Arthur Vance died on that burning concrete. The man who loved his family, the man who believed in justice and morality, simply ceased to exist. In his place, a roaring, consuming inferno of pure, unadulterated rage ignited. It was a primal, animalistic fury born from the sheer will to survive. I rolled violently to the right, dodging a second stomp aimed at my skull. I ignored the warm blood pouring down my neck and grabbed the heavy, thick fabric of Rook's pant leg. I yanked with every ounce of desperate strength I possessed. Rook lost his balance, falling forward with a heavy thud. The rusted shiv skittered across the concrete, coming to rest in a small patch of shadow. I scrambled toward it, my fingers scraping against the rough ground, tearing the skin. The other 3 men closed in, their shouts blending with the roaring chaos of the yard. I wrapped my hand around the cold, hard metal of the makeshift handle. The jagged edge gleamed with my own blood. I did not hesitate. I did not feel a single drop of guilt or sorrow. The morality I had clung to was a useless burden, discarded like a heavy coat in the desert heat. Rook pushed himself up, a snarl twisting his coarse features. I drove the sharp metal forward, driving it deep into the soft, unprotected flesh of his thigh. He let out a piercing, high-pitched scream that echoed across the yard, a sound of absolute terror that finally drew the attention of the remaining guards. A loud, piercing siren began to wail, a mechanical shriek that cut through the roaring crowd. I pulled the blade free and scrambled backward, my back hitting the cold, hard steel of the fence. The other 3 men hesitated, their eyes locked on the gleaming, bloody weapon in my trembling hand. I stared back at them, my breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. The man looking back at them was no longer a victim. The profound transformation was complete. Emotion. The blazing sun beat down on the chaotic scene, highlighting the stark reality of my new existence. The heavy boots of the riot squad thudded against the pavement, their shouts cutting through the haze of my adrenaline. They tackled me to the ground, pinning me against the rough, warm concrete. The cold steel of handcuffs ratcheted tightly around my wrists, biting into the flesh. I did not resist. I lay on the ground, the hot blood pooling beneath my cheek, a grim, dark satisfaction settling over my chaotic mind. They had tried to break me, to erase me completely from the world. Instead, they had forged Victor Thorne. Emotion. The brutal forgery of Victor Thorne was complete, and now I sat in the cold, dim warehouse, watching his creators tear each other apart in stark, bright, high-definition video. The heavy, hard metal chair dug into my spine as I leaned closer to the glowing monitors. The sharp blue glare illuminated the deep, dark shadows of my hidden control room. A soft, constant hum emanated from the massive server racks, accompanied by the stale scent of old dust and the sharp, metallic tang of hot circuitry. My fingers traced the rough, raised skin of the jagged scar on my jaw, a constant tactile reminder of the blood they had spilled. On the primary screen, the hidden surveillance feed from Marcus's executive office flickered slightly before stabilizing. The audio feed crackled, then cleared, filling the heavy silence of the warehouse with the sharp echo of Marcus's frantic pacing. He looked disheveled, the tailored suit wrinkled, his tie hanging loose around his neck. A thick sheen of warm sweat coated his forehead, catching the bright glare of the overhead lights. Elena stood near the heavy oak doors, her posture rigid, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The delicate, expensive perfume she always wore was absent from my senses, but the memory of its sickeningly sweet scent lingered like cold ash. "The accounts are entirely empty," Marcus roared, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, desperate frequency. He swept his arm across the smooth, polished surface of his mahogany desk, sending a stack of files crashing to the floor with a loud, heavy thud. $300 million, Elena, gone, vanished into the ether overnight. Elena took a slow step backward, her eyes widening in a sudden flash of genuine fear. She had married a titan of industry, a man who possessed absolute control. Now she was locked in a room with a cornered rabid animal. "I don't understand, Marcus. The encryption was supposed to be impenetrable. The security protocols. Do not lecture me on security." Marcus interrupted, pointing a trembling, sweaty finger directly at her face. He stepped closer, his heavy leather shoes thudding aggressively against the soft, thick carpet. The bank confirmed the access codes used were the primary administrative overrides. My overrides. The only other person who possessed that level of clearance was Arthur. A sharp electric thrill of malicious pleasure shot through my veins, pushing away the hollow ache of the long, lonely years. I watched his profound paranoia metastasize in real time, eating away at the fragile trust they had built on my grave. The heavy weight of his guilt was finally crushing him. "Arthur is dead," Elena screamed, her voice echoing sharply against the wood paneling. The manufactured sorrow she had displayed at the gala was entirely gone, replaced by a raw, primal panic. "He died in that concrete box 2 years ago. You paid for it. I saw the coroner's report." "Then who drained the accounts, Elena?" Marcus hissed, closing the physical distance between them until he was looming over her. His breath was visible in the cold, bright light, a violent gasp of desperation. Who placed his personalized monogrammed pen on my desk yesterday morning? A ghost? Elena stared at the platinum pen sitting exactly where I had placed it, the bright metal gleaming maliciously. A deep, heavy shudder ran through her slender frame. The profound, sickening realization that her perfect, stolen world was unraveling struck her with the force of a physical blow. Marcus, you are not thinking clearly. This is a targeted corporate attack, a rival firm. We need to involve the authorities. The authorities? Marcus laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that scraped like rough sandpaper. And tell them what? That the illegal offshore accounts holding the funds I embezzled from the company have been compromised. That the fortune we accumulated through perjury and murder is missing. I leaned back in the cold metal chair, exhaling a slow, quiet breath. The absolute, vindicated isolation I felt was a dark, intoxicating nectar. I had spent years drowning in a vast ocean of deep despair and blind anger, struggling to carry the crushing burden of their absolute betrayal. Now, I watched them drown each other in that same ocean. You took it, Marcus stated, the frantic energy suddenly dropping into a cold, deadly whisper. He reached out and grabbed her upper arm with a rough, hard grip. You realized the Apollo initiative was a massive risk. You saw the company bleeding capital, and you decided to secure your own future. You hired someone to bypass the encryption. Let go of me, Elena gasped, struggling against his grip. The sharp, sudden violence of the movement sent a visceral shockwave through the screen. You are insane. I have no access to those funds. You always were an opportunistic parasite. Marcus roared, shoving her backward. Emotion, vark wardery. She stumbled, her shoulder slamming into the heavy oak door with a loud, sickening crackle. She cried out, clutching her arm, a look of profound, devastating shock twisting her features. The love they claimed to share, the twisted bond forged in the fires of their mutual betrayal, shattered completely in that bright, sterile room. There was no trust remaining. There was only a hollow, desperate fear. I reached out and smoothly turned the volume knob down, reducing their screaming to a soft, distant murmur. The heavy, dark shadows of the warehouse wrapped around me like a protective cloak. The profound loss I had suffered would never be fully erased, but the pure, sadistic joy of watching their absolute destruction was a powerful balm. The Queen and the King were locked in a death spiral, exactly as I had designed. I picked up a cold cup of stale coffee, taking a slow sip, and waited for the final, brutal checkmate. Emotion, the final, brutal checkmate required a deeply personal touch. A heavy, cold black titanium drive delivered directly to the imposing iron gates of Marcus Vance's secluded estate. The midnight air was thick and heavy, carrying the damp, stale scent of decaying leaves and the sharp, metallic tang of the approaching rain. I stood perfectly still in the deep, impenetrable shadows of the old oak trees lining the perimeter of his massive property. The dim, soft glow of the ornate street lamps cast long, dark silhouettes across the smooth, wet asphalt, but the bright, blinding glare of the perimeter security floods did not reach my position. The physical distance between my hiding spot and the gleaming metal call box was less than 20 yards. A profound sense of focused anticipation hummed through my warm veins, a steady electric current replacing the vast, hollow despair that had consumed my past. The absolute inevitability of his doom was a heavy, intoxicating weight in my rough hands. I was no longer a victim consumed by blind anger and suffocating sorrow. I was the architect of their complete destruction, finalizing the structural collapse of their stolen empire. I adjusted the collar of my dark, heavy wool coat, the rough fabric scratching slightly against the raised skin of my jagged scar. The silence of the affluent neighborhood was absolute, broken only by the soft, rhythmic rustle of the wind through the high branches and the distant low hum of a passing luxury vehicle. I reached into my deep pocket and withdrew the small, hard package. It was a simple, unmarked black envelope containing a single, heavily encrypted titanium flash drive. It held the incontrovertible, high-definition audio proof of their original betrayal, the recorded phone call between Marcus and the hitman he had hired to end my life 2 years ago. The profound guilt of surviving, the heavy shame of failing to see their treachery, evaporated entirely into the cold, damp air. My heart beat with a slow, powerful rhythm, a testament to the death of my old morality. I stepped out from the thick shadows, my leather shoes hitting the wet asphalt with a soft, muted thud. The security system surrounding Marcus's estate was formidable, a labyrinth of motion sensors, infrared cameras, and laser tripwires. But like the corporate network, I had designed the foundational architecture of this system when Marcus first purchased the property. He had upgraded the hardware, but he had left the core legacy protocols entirely intact, driven by a foolish, arrogant trust in his own invulnerability. I approached the massive iron gates, staying carefully within the narrow, precise blind spot I knew existed between the primary camera feeds. The dim light flickered slightly, a brief, unstable flash that mirrored the chaotic state of his crumbling life. I did not attempt to breach the main perimeter. I simply crouched down, the rough concrete scraping against the knee of my trousers. I slid the cold, smooth black envelope under the tiny gap beneath the heavy iron gate. It came to rest perfectly on the wet, bright marble of the interior driveway. The stark contrast of the dark package against the pale stone was a visual scream. A sudden, sharp gasp of wind swept through the trees, a cold, violent breath that chilled the warm sweat forming on my forehead. I stood up, stepping backward into the protective embrace of the dark shadows. The metallic click of the call box recording my movement was entirely absent. The ghost had visited, leaving behind a tangible artifact of absolute doom. When the private security guards completed their morning rotation, they would find the package. They would run it through the scanners, finding nothing but the heavy encryption, and they would hand it directly to Marcus. He would plug the cold metal drive into his private terminal. He would break the simple encryption I had purposefully layered over the file. And then he would hear his own voice. He would hear the undeniable proof of his murderous betrayal, a digital ghost rising from the cold ash to drag him down into the abyss. The crushing weight of the evidence, combined with the catastrophic loss of his hidden wealth, would shatter his fragile sanity completely. The psychological pressure would force him to make a desperate, fatal mistake. A soft, cold drizzle began to fall, the tiny drops pattering against the heavy wool of my coat. The fresh scent of rain mixed with the stale dust of the street. I turned away from the massive iron gates, walking back down the quiet, empty avenue. A sharp, brilliant flash of lightning briefly illuminated the heavy, dark clouds gathering overhead, followed immediately by the deep, resonant roar of distant thunder. The storm was finally here, and Marcus Vance was standing entirely exposed in the pouring rain. Emotion. I smiled, a tight, cold expression devoid of any love or forgiveness, and disappeared entirely into the deep, welcoming darkness of the night. The final trap was sprung. With the final trap sprung, I maneuvered Elena Vance to the exact position I wanted her, the sharp, pungent scent of expensive oil paint and stale turpentine failing to mask the desperate fear radiating from her rigid posture. The modern art gallery was a vast, open space of stark, blinding white walls and cold, hard concrete floors. The overhead lighting cast a harsh, bright glare that illuminated every microscopic flaw in the patrons passing by. A soft, pretentious hum of classical string music echoed from hidden speakers, a stark contrast to the loud, chaotic roar of the city traffic muffled by the thick glass windows. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored suit, the rough, textured wool a comfortable shield against the sterile environment. Elena stood alone near a massive, abstract canvas, staring with vacant eyes at the violent splashes of red and black. She wore a dark, heavy coat, her customary impeccable hair now out of place. The dark, heavy shadows beneath her eyes were a testament to the sleepless nights Marcus's unraveling paranoia had caused without question. I approached her from a blind angle, my leather shoes hitting the smooth concrete without a single thud or click. The profound, hollow ache of absolute despair that had once consumed my soul was gone, replaced by a cold, cynical mastery of the board. The artist seems obsessed with the concept of inevitable, violent collapse, I murmured, my voice a soft, rough whisper that cut through the ambient silence. Elena gasped, a sharp, ragged intake of breath. She spun around, her high heels emitting a loud crackle against the floor. The polite, charming facade she wore with such ease was absent. Her face was pale, a thin sheen of cold sweat shimmering on her forehead under the bright lights. The absolute terror in her wide, dark eyes was a profound validation of my strategy. She recognized the threat I posed, even if she still believed I was just Victor Thorne, the ruthless investor. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice trembling. She clutched her expensive handbag against her chest with crushing force, treating the soft leather like a heavy shield. I did not expect to see you here. A mutual associate recommended the exhibition, I lied, closing the physical distance between us. The manipulative ease of the interaction was intoxicating, a powerful narcotic that washed away any lingering sorrow or grief. I heard rumors that Vance Enterprise is experiencing a sudden catastrophic loss of liquidity. The financial sectors are buzzing with whispers of an impending federal audit. Elena flinched, the subtle movement a massive tell. The sharp fear escalated into a suffocating, crushing panic. My husband's business affairs are secure. The rumors are baseless. Marcus is restructuring our core assets for a major acquisition. Is that what he told you? I asked, tilting my head a fraction. A cold, sharp smile touched the edge of my scarred jaw. The warm glow of the gallery lighting caught the jagged, rough skin, highlighting the physical cost of their betrayal. I have found that men backed into a corner often resort to desperate, chaotic measures. They will sacrifice everything to survive. She stared at me, the profound weight of my words settling upon her shoulders. The absolute trust she had placed in Marcus, the very foundation of their bloody alliance, was crumbling into cold ash. I don't understand what you are implying, Elena whispered, looking with panic toward the gallery exit. The dim afternoon light filtering through the front windows cast long, dark shadows across the room, mimicking the closing walls of a prison cell. I am implying that Marcus is preparing a lifeboat, Mrs. Vance, and there is only room for one, I stated, my tone devoid of any empathy. The words struck with the blunt, heavy force of a hammer. The offshore accounts have been drained. The corporate ledgers are doctored. When the federal investigators breach the gates, they will need a scapegoat. A convenient target who possessed the administrative access and the motive to steal the funds. The color drained from her face. She took a slow, unsteady step backward, her shoulder bumping against the hard, smooth wall. He wouldn't. I am his wife. I helped him build this. You helped him steal it from your late husband, I corrected with blunt force, the brutal truth slicing through her desperate rationalizations. A man willing to orchestrate the murder of his own brother and the imprisonment of a man who loved him. What loyalty do you honestly believe he holds for you? The moment the burden becomes too heavy, he will trade your freedom for his own. Elena squeezed her eyes shut, a visible tremor shaking her slender frame. The suffocating weight of her own guilt and shame was crashing down upon her. The luxurious, comfortable world she had built on a foundation of profound lies was disintegrating. Tense, he accused me, she whispered, her voice a fragile wisp over the hum of the music. Last night, he screamed that I stole the money. He said I forged the transfer orders. The narrative is already written, I said, leaning in closer. The strong scent of her perfume was overwhelmed by the sharp, metallic tang of her absolute terror. He is establishing the paper trail. He will present you as the mastermind, a grieving widow driven mad by greed. You will rot in a damp concrete cell while he negotiates a comfortable plea deal. She opened her eyes, a wild, desperate hope igniting in the dark depths. It was the frantic, clawing hope of a drowning victim reaching for a rusted anchor. What can I do? He controls everything. The security, the accounts. He controls the present, I replied, stepping back. The cynical mastery of the moment was absolute. I was handing her a loaded weapon and pointing her at Marcus. But you control the past, Elena. You know the exact nature of the original crimes. If you want to survive the coming storm, you must strike first. You must expose the rot at the foundation before he buries you beneath it. I did not wait for a response. I turned and walked away, my footsteps falling quiet on the hard concrete. I walked out through the heavy glass doors into the bright, blinding glare of the afternoon sun. The psychological manipulation was a pristine success. The final threads of their alliance were severed. The king and queen were no longer just falling. They were actively pulling each other down into the crushing darkness. Emotion, the crushing darkness of their collapse, provided the perfect backdrop for my entrance into the blinding, sterile light of the Vance Enterprise boardroom, where the scent of stale coffee mingled with absolute panic. A violent, rolling thunderstorm raged outside the massive glass windows, the bright, jagged flash of lightning casting long, dark shadows across the polished mahogany table. The ambient silence of the room was heavy, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic tap of rain against the thick panes and the low, mechanical hum of the air conditioning. I adjusted the lapels of my dark wool suit, the rough fabric a stark contrast to the smooth, cold metal of the door handle. I pushed the heavy oak doors open with a loud, resounding thud. The entire board of directors turned to stare. The profound, hollow ache of my past was gone, replaced by a pure, triumphant dominance that surged through my warm veins. I walked into the room, my leather shoes hitting the hard, slick marble floor with a slow, deliberate cadence. Marcus stood at the head of the table. He looked small, a pathetic, broken shell of a man. His expensive suit hung loose on his shrinking frame, and a thick sheen of cold sweat coated his pale forehead. The heavy burden of his profound guilt and the crushing weight of his missing fortune had aged him a decade in a single week. "This is a closed session," Marcus croaked, his voice a weak, trembling whisper that barely carried over the roar of the storm outside. The arrogant facade he wore for so long was nothing but ash. "The agenda requires an immediate amendment," I stated, my voice a deep, gravel-like rumble that commanded absolute attention. I walked to the opposite end of the long table, the sharp, cold glare of the overhead lights reflecting off the silver water pitchers. The scent of ozone from the storm seeped through the vents, a sharp, metallic tang. "I am claiming the primary seat." A murmur of confusion rippled through the seated executives. I reached into my pocket and retrieved a thick, heavy stack of crisp, white documents. I tossed them onto the smooth, polished wood. They landed with a sharp, heavy slap. "Those are the certified transfer protocols," I announced, meeting the confused stare of the chief legal counsel. "Victor Thorne is now the majority shareholder of Vance Enterprise, the offshore shell companies that absorbed the missing $300 million yesterday afternoon. They belong to my portfolio. The capital was converted into a massive, hostile acquisition of your outstanding public stock." Marcus gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning a stark bone white. He gasped for air, his chest heaving with a sudden, suffocating fear. The absolute betrayal he had orchestrated years ago had finally returned to consume him. The malicious pleasure blooming in my chest was a hot, fierce fire, burning away any lingering sorrow or grief over the brother I had lost. "You," Marcus wheezed, his eyes widening as a bright flash of lightning illuminated the room. He stared at the jagged, rough scar on my jaw, his gaze tracing the violent mark of my primal survival. The pieces of the puzzle crashed together in his mind, shattering his fragile reality. "The pen, the voice recording, it was you." I offered a tight, cold smile devoid of any love or forgiveness. The arrogant dominance I felt was absolute. I had stripped away his wealth, his reputation, and his false security. I had forced Elena to turn against him, their twisted alliance broken beyond repair. "You stole the foundation of this empire through perjury and murder," I said, the blunt force of the words silencing the entire room. The executives stared in stunned, breathless horror. "You abandoned a sacred trust for a pathetic illusion of power, but the dead do not always remain buried. Sometimes they return from the cold, damp concrete to reclaim what is theirs." Marcus collapsed back into his heavy leather chair with a loud, sickening thud. The sheer terror in his eyes was a profound, beautiful masterpiece. He looked at me, seeing past the ash-colored hair and the scarred features, finally recognizing the architect of his destruction. "My dear brother," Marcus whispered, a single warm tear tracking through the cold sweat on his cheek. The sound of his voice carried a crushing, unbearable despair. "Arthur, what have you done?" "I executed a necessary hostile takeover," I replied, my tone an icy, impenetrable shield against his pathetic display of emotion. The hollow anger that had driven me for 2 years was finally sated. "The authorities are waiting in the lobby. They have the audio files detailing your arrangement with the hitman. They have the financial ledgers proving your massive embezzlement. Your reign is over." The heavy oak doors behind me swung open again, and 3 uniformed federal agents stepped into the bright, sterile light of the boardroom. The loud click of handcuffs echoing through the quiet space was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. I turned my back on him, walking toward the massive glass windows. I looked out over the sprawling, chaotic city below, a cold, dark satisfaction settling deep within my bones. The board was cleared, the king was captured, the empire of Arthur Vance was finally restored. But as the heavy silence stretched out behind me, a sudden terrifying question pierced the triumphant moment. What if the true mastermind was still waiting in the dark shadows? The true mastermind was still waiting in the dark shadows of my past. Born 1 year ago amid the deafening roar of a prison transport engine and the sharp, metallic tang of smuggled adrenaline. The heavy, reinforced steel walls of the transport van vibrated with intense force, rattling the hard, cold chains binding my wrists and ankles. The air inside the cramped compartment was thick, carrying the suffocating stench of stale sweat, cheap diesel fuel, and raw fear. A dim, flickering yellow bulb cast long, chaotic shadows over the faces of the 4 other inmates sharing the ride to the maximum security facility upstate. I sat in the corner, pressing the rough fabric of my orange jumpsuit against the vibrating metal wall. The profound, hollow ache of my absolute despair had evolved into a cold, desperate resolve. The men who framed me, the brother who orchestrated my downfall, still walked free. The crushing burden of my false imprisonment was a heavy weight I refused to carry any longer. I reached into the deep pocket of my jumpsuit, my fingers brushing against a small, smooth gelatin capsule. A corrupt guard, bought with the last hidden remnants of my personal fortune, had slipped it to me during breakfast. It contained a dangerous, concentrated dose of a synthetic beta blocker designed to slow the human heart rate to untraceable levels, inducing a state indistinguishable from clinical death. The risk of actual death was high, but the prospect of rotting in a damp, concrete cell while Marcus built his empire on my grave was a fate far worse. I swallowed the capsule dry. It scratched against my throat, leaving a bitter, chemical aftertaste. I closed my eyes, seeking absolute focus in the chaotic environment. 10 minutes passed. The heavy rumble of the van tires against the asphalt provided a steady, hypnotic rhythm. Then, the first wave hit. A sudden, sharp coldness bloomed in the center of my chest, spreading outward like a spiderweb of frost. My breathing became shallow, the air tasting thin and metallic. A wave of profound, suffocating darkness threatened to pull me under, but I clung to the fierce, burning rage anchoring my soul. I slumped forward, allowing the heavy chains to pull my body toward the hard, textured steel floor of the van. My shoulder struck the metal with a dull thud. The inmate beside me, a massive man with rough, scarred hands, jerked away. "Hey! Something is wrong with this guy," he shouted, his voice echoing in the confined space. The heavy transport van lurched, the brakes squealing with a loud, piercing shriek. The physical force threw my limp body against the opposite bench. A sharp pain radiated through my ribs, but the sensation felt distant, as if happening to another person. My vision narrowed into a dark, blurry tunnel. The edges of the world began to dissolve into cold ash. The absolute betrayal I suffered, the love I lost, the profound grief consuming my family. It all faded into a quiet, heavy silence. The back doors of the van flew open with a loud metallic clang. A blast of cold, damp air rushed in, carrying the scent of wet asphalt and impending rain. 2 guards scrambled into the compartment, their heavy black boots thudding against the floor. "Get back! Everyone get back!" one guard ordered, drawing his baton. He knelt beside me, his rough hands grabbing my shoulder. He flipped me onto my back, the hard metal floor sending a final shockwave through my spine. I stared upward without focus, my eyes fixed on the flickering yellow light. The world was spinning, a chaotic carousel of sound and shadow. The guard pressed 2 fingers against my neck, right over the jagged scar I earned the year before. The contact felt like a block of ice against my skin. "I can't find a pulse," the guard stated, a note of genuine panic cracking his voice. "He is freezing cold. Call it in. We need an ambulance right now." But the second guard unclipped his heavy radio, the static crackle filling the small space. "Control, this is Transport Unit 4. We have a code blue. Inmate Vance is unresponsive, no pulse, requesting immediate medical intercept." I felt the last ounce of strength drain from my muscles. The desperate resolve that fueled my survival was giving way to a total, encompassing commitment to the void. The heart monitor in the ambulance would register a flat line. The coroner, another piece on my hidden board, bought and paid for, would sign the death certificate. Arthur Vance would die on this cold steel floor, leaving behind only shame and sorrow for those who betrayed him. The roaring siren of an approaching ambulance pierced the heavy silence, a mechanical scream cutting through the damp air. The guards dragged my limp body out of the van, the rough asphalt scraping against the back of my legs. The blinding, harsh glare of the ambulance headlights washed over me, a brilliant flash of white before the absolute darkness claimed me. I sank into the cold abyss, surrendering to the profound, terrifying stillness of the fake death. The true mastermind was born in that crushing void, a ghost forged from betrayal and rage, ready to rise from the grave and orchestrate the ultimate vengeance. But as the darkness swallowed my consciousness completely, a singular haunting question echoed through the silence. Would I ever wake up? "Sign the paper, Mrs. Vance," I commanded, slamming a heavy white affidavit down onto the cold steel table of the interrogation room. The loud metallic crash severed the heavy silence, startling the woman sitting opposite me. I woke up from that cold abyss 1 year ago, and now I stood bathed in the sterile, buzzing glare of the overhead fluorescent lights, offering Elena the instrument of her own destruction. The room was a concrete box, devoid of any warmth or comfort, mirroring the physical cell they had condemned me to endure. A single small mirror dominated the right wall, the dark, reflective glass hiding the federal agents observing our final interaction. I rested my rough hands on the smooth surface of the table, feeling the rigid tension in my scarred jaw. Elena sat opposite me, her posture defeated, her shoulders slumped under the crushing burden of her collapsing world. The expensive silk blouse she wore was wrinkled, the top button undone. The sweet floral scent of her signature perfume was stale, overpowered by the sharp, bitter smell of cold sweat and absolute fear. She stared at the thick stack of papers, her wide eyes tracing the bold legal print with a frantic, desperate energy. "The terms are quite simple," I stated, my voice a low, rough rumble that cut through the humming silence. The vindicated cynicism blooming in my chest was a powerful narcotic, erasing the hollow ache of the long, lonely years. Complete legal immunity for your role in the embezzlement scheme, and a discreet, untraceable payout of $10 million to an offshore account of your choosing. She looked up, a tremor shaking her pale chin. The charming, opportunistic facade that had ensnared my trust years ago was gone. "And in exchange," she whispered, her voice cracking with the strain of profound despair. "In exchange, you sign that affidavit," I replied, tapping the thick document with a hard, calloused finger. A sharp, loud tap echoed in the small space. "You provide comprehensive sworn testimony detailing Marcus's orchestration of the corporate fraud, the wire fraud, and the conspiracy to commit murder. You surrender the private encryption keys to his hidden servers. You give them the definitive proof they need to lock him in a dark, concrete box for the remainder of his natural life." Elena squeezed her eyes shut, a visible shudder racking her slender frame. The profound guilt and shame of her actions were finally catching up to her, a tidal wave of consequences crashing against her fragile reality. "He is my husband. We built a life together. You built an illusion on a foundation of betrayal and blood," I corrected with blunt force. The raw anger simmering beneath my calm exterior threatened to boil over, but I maintained a cold, rigid control. "You stood in a crowded courtroom and lied under oath. You orchestrated the destruction of an innocent man. Do not pretend you possess a moral compass now. Your loyalty is a commodity, bought and sold to the highest bidder." She opened her eyes, a flash of defensive rage igniting in the dark depths. "You do not understand. You did not know my late husband. Poor Arthur. He was weak. He lacked the vision, the ambition to elevate the company. Marcus offered a path to true greatness. I did what was necessary." The sheer, unadulterated narcissism of her rationalization sent a surge of grim satisfaction through my warm veins. She was still clinging to the pathetic lies, refusing to accept the massive weight of her own corruption. She believed the false narrative they had spun to justify their greed. "Your love for power eclipsed any genuine emotion you ever felt," I countered, leaning forward until my face entered the bright glare of the overhead lamp. The jagged, rough scar on my jaw was on full display. "You traded your humanity for a corner office and a platinum credit card, and now the bill has arrived." Elena stared at the scar, her breath hitching in a sudden sharp gasp. The frantic gears turning in her mind ground to a violent halt. A look of absolute breathtaking horror washed over her features as the impossible truth finally penetrated her thick wall of denial. The color drained from her skin, leaving her looking like a pale, hollow ghost. "Arthur?" she choked out, the name tearing from her throat like a physical wound. She pushed back from the table, the heavy metal chair scraping against the concrete floor with a loud, piercing shriek. "No, no, that is impossible, my love. You died in that transport van. The coroner. The coroner was an investment, I said, my tone as cold and hard as the steel table between us. I stood up, towering over her trembling form. The man you betrayed died on that freezing floor, but I survived. I endured the grief, the sorrow, and the profound loss you inflicted upon me. Emotion. I forged myself into a weapon designed for one singular purpose: absolute ruin. Elena raised a shaking hand to her mouth, tears streaming down her pale cheeks. The absolute, soul-crushing terror in her eyes was a beautiful masterpiece, a portrait of profound devastation. She was cornered, trapped in a cage of her own making, facing a ghost she could not escape. "Sign the paper, Elena," I commanded, the cold authority in my voice leaving no room for negotiation. "Condemn Marcus to the abyss, just as you condemned me. Take the money and disappear into the shadows. Or refuse and join him in the federal penitentiary. The choice is yours." She stared at the white paper, the heavy silence of the room pressing down upon her like a physical weight. The choice was obvious. The instinct for primal survival, the same instinct that had saved my life, overrode any lingering loyalty she held for Marcus. With a trembling, hesitant motion, she reached for the black pen resting beside the document. The final act of betrayal was set in motion, completing the circle of absolute vengeance. But as she brought the pen to the paper, a sudden, terrifying question echoed in the deafening silence. What if the true trap was just beginning to close around her? The true trap had closed around Marcus, a cold, suffocating reality he was discovering inside the stark, buzzing walls of the federal holding facility. I stood in the adjacent observation room, shielded by a large pane of thick, one-way glass. The room smelled of stale coffee, sharp floor wax, and the damp dust of old government concrete. The bright, harsh fluorescent lights above cast no shadows, illuminating every crack and blemish in the sterile environment. A low, mechanical hum emanated from the ventilation grate near the ceiling, vibrating against my leather shoes. I rested my rough palms against the smooth, cold glass, watching the final act of my grand revenge unfold in complete silence. Marcus sat at a small, scratched metal table in the center of the holding cell. The expensive, tailored suit he had worn to the boardroom was gone, replaced by a cheap, bright orange jumpsuit that mirrored the one I had worn 2 years ago. The heavy burden of his profound guilt and the crushing weight of his absolute ruin pressed down upon his shoulders. He looked small, broken, and terrified. A federal public defender, a young man clutching a thick manila folder, sat across from him. The audio feed piped into my observation room crackled, breaking the heavy silence. "The charges are comprehensive, Mr. Vance," the attorney stated, his voice a flat, emotionless drone. He slid a thick stack of white papers across the metal table. "Conspiracy to commit murder, massive corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and severe obstruction of justice. The evidence is overwhelming. The offshore accounts you used to hide the funds have been seized." Marcus grabbed the edges of the table, his knuckles turning bone white under the bright lights. He gasped for air, his chest heaving with frantic, desperate energy. "Seized? By the government? I need those funds to mount a defense. We can fight the corporate charges. I am the founder of Vance Enterprise." "You are no longer affiliated with Vance Enterprise," the attorney corrected with blunt force. He flipped open the manila folder, revealing a series of crisp, certified bank documents. "Your entire portfolio, the stock, the real estate, the liquid assets, was legally acquired through a series of complex proxy transactions over the past month. The entity known as the Apollo Initiative executed a total hostile takeover. Your estate, your vehicles, even the pension accounts, they belong to the new majority shareholder." Marcus stared at the documents, his dark eyes widening in absolute, breathtaking horror. The color drained from his pale face, leaving him looking like a hollow ghost. He reached out with trembling hands, picking up the top page. The paper rustled, a soft sound amplified by the sensitive microphones. "Victor Thorne," Marcus wheezed, his voice cracking with profound despair. He dropped the paper, a physical shudder racking his thin frame. He buried his face in his rough hands. The realization that he possessed nothing, no power, no wealth, no leverage, crashed over him like a tidal wave. The roaring fire of rage that had sustained me for 2 years, the desperate need for absolute vengeance, flickered and died in the cold air of the observation room. I had expected a massive surge of triumph, a rush of pure joy at the sight of his total destruction. Instead, a profound, chilling existential emptiness rushed in to fill the void. The hollow victory tasted like bitter ash in my mouth. I had stripped him of everything, just as he had stripped me. But the vast ocean of grief and sorrow remained untouched. My past was still dead. The years I lost in that damp concrete box would never return. The brother I loved, the man I trusted with my life, had betrayed me for a pathetic illusion of power. Marcus lowered his hands, staring at the blank metal wall opposite him. He did not know I was watching, but he spoke to the empty space with a raw, shattered voice. "My dear brother, Arthur, you warned me. You told me the greed would consume the foundation. You told me the company was built on trust, not ruthless ambition." He let out a harsh, broken sob, a sound of pure agony that echoed off the hard walls. The shame of his actions, the horrific reality of his betrayal, was finally tearing him apart from the inside out. He had traded his soul for an empire, and now the empire was gone. "I have nothing," Marcus whispered, the words hanging heavy in the sterile air. "The deceased, he has taken everything. He is a ghost, and he has dragged me into the grave with him." I stepped back from the cold glass, the sound of my leather shoes echoing sharp and clear in the quiet observation room. The psychological destruction was absolute. I had become the monster I needed to be to survive. I had orchestrated a flawless symphony of ruin, emotion. But as I turned away from the glass, a sudden terrifying question echoed in the heavy silence. Now that the war was over, what purpose remained for a ghost forged only for revenge? To answer the final question of my existence, I summoned my creators to the dark, silent penthouse, where the air still carried the faint, metallic scent of my original betrayal. I had arranged for their temporary release on exorbitant bail, pulling the invisible strings of the criminal justice system with cold precision. I stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling, glowing city. The room was cast in deep, long shadows, illuminated only by the harsh silver light of the full moon cutting through the glass. The air was thick and cold, carrying the faint smell of old dust and stale ozone. I ran my rough thumb over the smooth, hard surface of the platinum fountain pen in my hand, feeling the solid weight of the past. Behind me, the heavy oak doors of the private elevator hissed open. Two sets of footsteps echoed across the bare, polished hardwood floor. One was the slow, dragging shuffle of leather shoes. The other was the sharp, hesitant click of high heels. "You requested our presence," Marcus croaked, his voice a dry, rasping sound that shattered the quiet atmosphere. I turned around, stepping out of the deep shadows and into the stark moonlight. The righteous wrath that had fueled my survival for the past 2 years condensed into a terrifying clarity. The hollow ache of despair was gone, replaced by the burning heat of absolute purpose. Marcus stood near the entrance, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. He looked like a fragile, crumbling statue, his once tailored suit hanging off his gaunt frame. Elena stood a few feet away from him, clutching a simple black coat around her shoulders. The arrogant, charming facade they had both worn for years was stripped bare, revealing the raw, unadulterated fear underneath. "Welcome back to the scene of the crime," I said, my voice a deep, gravel-like rumble that vibrated through the empty room. Elena stared at me, her wide, dark eyes fixed on the jagged scar slicing across my jawline. A visible tremor shook her hands. She had suspected the truth in the interrogation room, but standing here, in the home we once shared, the impossible reality was undeniable. "My love," Elena whispered, the words trembling with a pathetic mixture of terror and fake sorrow. She took a tentative step forward. "Poor Arthur, I thought you were dead. The reports..." "The reports were a convenient fiction," I interrupted, the blunt force of my words stopping her in her tracks. "A fiction you both eagerly accepted. It was easier to believe I was rotting in a concrete box or dead on a transport floor than to face the massive guilt of your betrayal." Marcus tightened his grip on the wooden cane, his knuckles turning bone white in the cold light. He could not meet my gaze. The crushing shame of his actions forced him to stare at the floor. "We made a mistake," Marcus choked out, a single warm tear tracking through the dirt on his cheek. The sound of his voice carried a pathetic, desperate hope. "My dear brother, Arthur, we were weak. The ambition, the greed, it consumed us. But we are family. The founder of this empire would not want this." "Do not speak to me of family," I roared, the raw anger finally breaking through my rigid control. The sheer volume of my voice sent them both recoiling backward. The air in the penthouse seemed to crackle with electric tension. "You orchestrated my destruction. You stole my life, my company, and my freedom. You abandoned a sacred trust for a transient illusion of power. I crossed the room with long, deliberate strides, stopping just a few feet away from them. The sharp scent of their absolute panic was intoxicating. I was no longer the soft, forgiving man they had known. I was the monster they had forged in the dark. I endured a profound loss, I continued, lowering my voice to a cold, menacing whisper. I carried the heavy burden of your lies. I felt the pure, suffocating grief of a man erased from the world. You left me with nothing but the clothes on my back and the rage in my heart. We will give it all back, Elena sobbed, her voice echoing sharp and loud in the empty space. The money, the properties, everything. Just let us go. I already have everything, I replied, a tight, cold smile touching my scarred features. The terrifying clarity of the moment was absolute. The empire is mine, the offshore accounts are drained, the evidence of your crimes is secured in federal vaults. Marcus slumped against the wall, a hollow, defeated sound escaping his lips. Then why bring us here? The deceased have already claimed their vengeance. What more do you want? I brought you here to show you the true cost of your ambition, I said, tossing the platinum fountain pen onto the hard floor. It clattered with a loud, sharp, ringing noise. I brought you here to witness the death of the man you betrayed. Arthur Vance died in the cold abyss. Victor Thorne stands before you now, and Victor Thorne does not forgive. I turned my back on them and walked toward the private elevator. The heavy silence of the penthouse stretched out behind me, filled only with the sound of their ragged, desperate breathing. The final confrontation was over. The checkmate was absolute. I stepped into the elevator, the cold metal doors sliding shut, leaving them trapped in the dark shadows of their ruined lives, waiting for the inevitable arrival of the federal marshals. The past was finally buried, but the future stretched out before me, vast and uncertain. Emotion, tense before stepping into the vast and uncertain future, I hit the heavy red override switch on the elevator panel, the loud grinding screech of metal locking us together in the dark shadows of the penthouse. The heavy steel doors froze, leaving a narrow gap that let in the cold, howling wind from the terrace. I turned back to face them. The absolute detachment I felt was a shield of solid ice, locking out the hollow ache of my past. The time for games was over. I needed to hear the ugly truth stripped of all its pathetic illusions. Marcus flinched at the harsh mechanical noise, shrinking back against the cold glass of the massive window. The harsh silver moonlight cast deep, twisted shadows across his gaunt features. Elena stood frozen, her hands clutching the lapels of her black coat in a desperate grip. The overwhelming fear radiating from them was palpable, a thick, sour stench that tainted the stale air of the empty penthouse. You have 10 minutes before the federal marshals breach the lobby, I stated, my voice devoid of any warmth or anger, a flat drone of cold finality. I walked back toward the center of the room, my leather shoes clicking a slow, deliberate rhythm against the hardwood floor. 10 minutes to confess. Do not offer me apologies. Do not offer me excuses. Tell me exactly how you dismantled my life. Marcus gripped the silver handle of his cane, his knuckles white under the strain. We were bleeding capital, the expansion into the European markets. It was a massive disaster. A disaster born of your own reckless arrogance, I countered, the blunt force of my words striking him like a physical blow. You leveraged the core assets without my authorization. You created a massive deficit. But instead of accepting the profound shame of your failure, you chose a different path. Elena looked away, her dark eyes focusing on a spot of dust on the floor. We needed a scapegoat. The board was demanding answers. The investors were threatening a total liquidation. So you forged my signature on the wire transfers, I said, pointing a rigid finger at Marcus. The crushing weight of the memory was sharp, but the absolute detachment held firm. You orchestrated the fake ledgers. You bought the silence of the chief financial officer. Marcus nodded, a pathetic, jerky motion. Yes, I set the paper trail, but the murder, the hitman. He pointed a trembling hand at his wife. That was her idea. I swear it. I just wanted to force you out of the company. I did not want you dead. Elena whipped her head around, a sudden flash of defensive rage twisting her pale face. Do not lie, Marcus. You are a coward. You stood in this very room and handed the envelope of cash to the contractor. You paid for the weapon. You told me it was the only way to guarantee our safety. Marcus screamed, his voice cracking into a high, shrill note of pure desperation. You said Arthur would never stop digging. You said our founder would find the hidden accounts. I stood between them, watching the total collapse of their toxic alliance. The grim satisfaction was entirely absent, replaced only by a cold, analytical observation of their ruin. They were tearing each other apart, eager to shift the heavy burden of their guilt. The audio recordings prove you were both complicit, I stated, cutting through their chaotic shouting. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. You traded your humanity, your family, and your trust for a pile of dirty money. You watched me stand in that courtroom, taking the blame for your massive corruption. You watched the judge sentence me to a concrete box. Elena sank to her knees, the heavy thud echoing through the vast space. A single dark tear tracked through the heavy makeup on her cheek. My late husband, poor Arthur, we destroyed everything. The ambition, the greed, it blinded us. I am so sorry. The woman who loved Arthur Vance died a long time ago, I replied, the absolute detachment freezing the air between us. The grief and the profound sorrow I felt for you burned away in the prison yard. I am Victor Thorne now, and Victor Thorne has no capacity for forgiveness. I turned my attention to Marcus. He was shaking, a broken, pathetic shell of the arrogant man who had stolen my empire. The profound loss he had inflicted upon me was a dark void that could never be filled. But his absolute ruin brought a final sense of closure. My dear brother, Marcus whispered, the words carrying a crushing, unbearable despair. What will happen to us? You will spend the rest of your lives in a cold, damp cell, I answered, walking back toward the frozen elevator doors. You will feel the sheer, suffocating terror of isolation. You will experience the hollow emptiness of a life stripped of all meaning. You will reap the harvest you sowed. I pressed the red override switch again. The heavy metal doors jerked to life, sliding open with a loud, mechanical hum. I stepped inside the small, enclosed space, my back straight and my expression an impenetrable mask. The final act was complete. The past was buried under a mountain of federal evidence. The vast, uncertain future awaited, a blank slate for a man reborn from the ashes of betrayal. The elevator doors began to close, cutting off my view of the ruined couple kneeling in the dark shadows, their pathetic sobs echoing into the deafening silence. The deafening silence of their ruin faded as the heavy metal doors sealed shut. The low, mechanical hum of the descending elevator replacing the pathetic sound of their weeping. I leaned back against the cool, polished steel wall of the cabin, the physical vibration of the machinery humming through my dark wool suit. The intense, burning heat of righteous wrath that had fueled my survival for 2 long years was gone, replaced by a deep, melancholic closure. A profound, lingering isolation settled into my bones, a heavy weight that no amount of stolen wealth or perfect vengeance could ever lift. I closed my eyes, the harsh, bright glare of the overhead light burning red against my eyelids. The descent felt agonizingly slow, a long ride down from the pinnacle of the empire I had reclaimed only to discard. The elevator stopped with a soft, chiming bell. The doors slid open, revealing the grand, expansive lobby of the Vance Enterprise residential tower. The sprawling marble floors gleamed under the massive crystal chandeliers, a pristine monument to the empire I had built with my own hands. 2 federal marshals in dark windbreakers stood by the front desk, their heavy boots planted wide, hands resting near their tactical belts. The older marshal, a man with a thick grey moustache and cold, serious eyes, stepped forward, his badge catching the bright light of the lobby. Mr. Thorne, the marshal stated, a gruff, deep voice that carried an edge of professional respect. The perimeter is secure. The warrants are executed. The target assets are completely frozen. They are upstairs, in the main penthouse, I replied, my voice a flat, hollow sound in the vast, empty space. I gestured toward the private elevator bank, my hand steady despite the chaotic storm of emotions swirling beneath my cold exterior. They possess no weapons, no security detail, and no capital. They are completely destitute, trapped in the cage of their own making. The marshal nodded, motioning for his partner to proceed toward the elevators. We will take it from here. The fraud division appreciates your extensive cooperation in this complex matter. The evidence you provided is airtight. They will not see the outside of a courtroom for a very long time. Just do your job, I said, the words slipping out with a cold, absolute finality. I offered no smile, no handshake, and no further explanation. I turned away from the gold-plated reception desk and walked toward the heavy glass revolving doors. The profound loss of my former life was a dark, bottomless chasm. Arthur Vance was a man defined by trust, by love, by a desperate desire to build a legacy with his family. But Arthur Vance died on the cold, damp concrete floor of a prison transport van. He died holding the shattered pieces of a horrific betrayal, choking on the bitter truth of his brother's massive greed. I pushed through the revolving doors, stepping out into the freezing, rain-slicked streets of the city. The sharp, bitter wind bit through my thin coat, carrying the heavy scent of wet asphalt and sharp exhaust fumes. The vibrant, chaotic noise of the urban sprawl washed over me, the blaring horns of yellow taxis, the distant wail of a police siren, the harsh hiss of tires on wet pavement. The world continued to spin, indifferent to the massive destruction I had just orchestrated. A sleek black town car waited at the curb, its headlights cutting through the heavy mist rolling off the river. The driver, a quiet man paid well for his absolute discretion, stood holding a large black umbrella that shielded him from the driving rain. He opened the rear door, the heavy hinges completely silent. I stopped on the edge of the curb, looking up at the towering glass spire of the penthouse. The bright, sterile lights of the federal agents were already flashing in the top-floor windows, a chaotic strobe illuminating the final act of Marcus Vance's tragic, self-inflicted downfall. The massive guilt and shame that had driven him to madness were finally exposed to the world. The hollow shell of his stolen empire was crumbling into worthless ash. But as I stood in the cold rain, the ultimate victory tasted like bitter iron on my tongue. The profound grief of a brother lost to greed, the deep sorrow of a love corrupted by raw ambition, remained an open wound. The millions of dollars resting in my offshore accounts provided no real comfort. The heavy burden of my past was a ghost I would carry forever. I climbed into the dark, warm interior of the town car, the soft leather seats offering a temporary physical comfort against the chill. The driver shut the heavy door, cutting off the sharp bite of the freezing wind and the loud noise of the city streets. He slid behind the steering wheel, glancing at me through the rearview mirror. "Where to, Mr. Thorne?" he asked, his voice calm and even in the quiet cabin. "Drive," I commanded, staring out the tinted window as the towering monuments of my past vanished into the heavy, rolling fog. The anger and the despair were finally quiet. The massive board was clear. The long, bloody game was over. I sank back into the deep shadows of the moving car, embracing the cold, solitary existence of Victor Thorne, a man with no family, no history, and no illusions left to shatter.